Welcome to Connections, a podcast from the Graymere Church of Christ in Columbia, Tennessee. Our goal is to have discussions and messages that encourage us and strengthen our faith. We appreciate you joining us. Let's keep learning and growing together. We're here with Jason Hart, who I really appreciate taking the time to talk through some of these things with us. Jason is here for Revival. I think there were over 70 people who participated in the annual Youth Ministers Retreat. So you've already spoken, twice?
Twice.
And he's going to speak again tonight.
Yeah.
So in between all of that, we just asked him to sit down with us for a minute. But if you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your journey in ministry, and where you are in ministry right now.
Well, it's kind of an interesting one. I started out in youth ministry 3 years in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and I just wanted to preach. Mm-hmm. And that was a good place for me. I had an opportunity to preach 2 months out of the year because the preacher was in Ukraine. It was a great church to be a part of and to prepare me for preaching on a regular basis. And I was ready for the pulpit and started out at Westview in Lewisburg, Tennessee. So just right down the road.
Yeah.
Was there for about 5 years. Moved to Cookeville, worked with the Sycamore Church as their preacher for 5 years, then moved to Murray, Kentucky, and was their pulpit preacher for about 5 years. So 15 years of preaching. And it was at that time I wasn't burnt out on preaching, or I wasn't burnt out on ministry, but I was burnt out on preaching. And so I needed to have a shift. An opportunity came open to move to my wife's hometown of Harrison. And so I started as their youth minister, and we're working on year 10 right now.
Wow.
So I like to tell people, because I did have a friend. I had a friend that whenever I told her that I was going to be the youth minister, she said, "Isn't that a step backwards?" And so I like to say from time to time, I have stepped up to youth ministry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really, it's just I stepped sideways to a different kind of ministry, but I enjoy youth ministry. I enjoy the diversity of it. I also like that I got into youth ministry when my kids were old enough to go traveling with us. And so my ministry, that's kind of the way that I thought of it whenever I was preaching. But whenever we went back I already did it. When we went back into youth ministry, it became our ministry. And my wife is as much a part of that ministry as I am.
Absolutely.
Actually, she's a better youth minister than I am. I mean, she relates better with the boys in the youth group than I do. So,
well, that's one thing I was thinking of, just getting to duck in a little bit at Revival and just looking in that room and seeing how many youth ministers and with their wives, and some of them had kids here, and just thinking about how many families in different places are investing so much time and effort into that. It was really encouraging. And as a parent who has children in the youth group, that also does change your perspective. I always appreciated youth ministers, but then when you see the positive difference that can make in your own children's lives, it's a whole new level of appreciation.
Yeah.
But there is sometimes kind of that understanding, or I would say maybe a misunderstanding of what different ministry roles are. And to me, one of the fun things about what I do, about what any of us do in ministry, is you'll usually get to do a little bit of everything. You'll get to preach here. You'll get to teach adults. You'll get to teach kids. You get to do all kinds of things like that, which is powerful. And as we're thinking about teaching, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about something that I've been impressed with over the years. I mean, I'm thankful that we've been friends for a long time. And for Graymere listeners, you were a big part of getting the Future Minister Camp here going when Kirk was starting that. Kirk Brothers started that and have been a big part of it over the years. And so thankful for that. But one of the things I can remember, it's been several years ago now, but I can remember a conversation in one of our sessions. It may even have been a video where you were walking our campers at the time through how you teach the story of Scripture. And I've really benefited over the years just seeing updates and talking with you about it. So I wonder if you could take us through maybe the process of maybe what you saw where you thought, I wonder if I could approach this a certain way, and then kind of what you've learned as you've done it that way.
Okay. Well, let's start it like this. We all belong to a story.
Mm-hmm.
We all have a narrative that we belong to. But most of us, our story begins the day we were born. If when we take the Bible and we see it as a story that we are invited to be a part of, now my story didn't begin at my birth.
Mm.
My story began with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it's a story that will not conclude, but will transition with, and they shall reign forevermore.
Mm.
So, that's how we tell our children's stories. Once upon a time, and they lived happily ever after. And what we have with the Bible story is, in the beginning, God, and he made man and woman in his image to rule over the creation. Of course, sin enters into the picture, but what's the end of the story? The end of Revelation is, and they shall reign forevermore. Like us with Jesus reigning forevermore.
Yeah.
And so this is the timeline that I am a part of. And that's really very exciting, because now I see that, my history, my ancestry doesn't just go through my parents, but it actually goes all the way back to Abraham.
Mm.
And I belong to that family who God called to bless the world. So really what I've just said what my identity is, I've said what my belonging is, and I've said what my purpose is. Those are three great questions.
Yeah.
Who am I? Where do I fit? What am I supposed to be doing? And really, those are three of the most important questions for teenagers to answer. So, that's part of it, is helping our teenagers to be able to see that they belong to a story, that they are developing a worldview. If you want to stop me and say, hey, go on to this,
no,
just let me know. But
well, it struck me as you were talking about that, those three questions are so important for all of us always, but especially for teens, and especially in a time when there's so much talk about identity and who we are and purpose, and just to have them grounded in the biblical story, I would imagine is such a powerful way to address any topic. You can keep coming back to that for teens. Right. This is who we are.
Yeah. And there's more questions. And that's what I was going to go to next was, by showing them a more holistic understanding of that story. I think the Bible Project, they call it,
Mm-hmm.
A continuous story, that focuses on Jesus or something like that. It'll come to my mind probably sometime late tonight. But seeing that story helps them to develop a worldview. We all have worldviews. It's the lens through which we view the world. And we ask questions to figure out what that worldview is. And I know J. Richard Middleton has used this, and it's pretty good. N.T. Wright used it from J. Richard Middleton, and Tim Mackey has used it as well. But there are 6 questions to ask. Where are we? Who are we? What is the problem? What is the solution? What time is it? How then should we live? And one of the things that I've noticed through the years, and this was true with my own teaching, but I see it other places as well, most of the teaching that we have on the Bible, about the Bible, is to try to answer partway that 6th question. We say, how shall we live? And so we dive into the Bible to say, well, what does the Bible tell me about how to live like this? But if we have the worldview, it's no longer how shall I live, but it's answering those questions. I'll go through them again.
Yeah.
Where are we? Who are we? What is the problem? What is the solution? What time is it? How then shall I live? So by asking those questions and answering those questions, I then have a firmer foundation of how I am supposed to live in the world.
Yeah. So I love the way that trains us not only to think critically about the text of whatever scripture we're looking at, but the place of that scripture, but also of us in the larger story and how that might change my understanding or what needs to be done. And if we're asking questions like those you laid out specifically, that seems like it'd be a habit that could develop, hopefully, for teenagers, especially, to start trying to find themselves instead of reading scripture and reading ourselves into it or our present situation into something in scripture. You're reading scripture saying, okay, here's where this is in light of everything that's happened. Now I know where I fit. Now, how does that relate here?
Yeah.
Connecting those two things.
So you find yourself entering into the story, rather than you just seeing the text. I was actually talking to John David about this earlier, and it was a podcast recently that I heard. I'd listened to a lot of podcasts, read a lot of books as well. But the statement was made, the Bible was meant to be heard, not seen. And recently I was talking to our teenagers about this. Whenever we sit down in the auditorium and we sing songs, it would be one thing, pick up a song book and you read the words and you learn that way. That's good. But whenever you sing the songs, you pick up on the rhythms and the patterns, and you're hearing it.
Yeah.
And whenever we read our Bibles, if we are reading them to hear it, kind of like Jesus, he that has ears, let him hear. You pick up on the patterns. I would say patterns are more important than the meanings of the words that are within those patterns. So it's a story. It's a narrative, and the scripture is amazing like that. It's a masterpiece, incredibly artistic. I'll give you one example, and I'll only say this because we were in Mark chapter 4 this last Sunday. Mark chapter 4, there is a very unique pattern here. You see, Mark chapter 4, verse 1, Jesus, he sits down in a boat, or he gets in a boat and he sits down on the sea. That's the very first verse. Mark chapter 4 is one of the only places you'll see that a pattern so tightly knitted together in a single chapter. And the very last story in Mark chapter 4 is when Jesus stills the storm. He's in a boat on the sea, and the disciples cry out, or they say, who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? And Mark is drawing off of, I think it's Psalm 29, where his voice thunders over the waters. And there's a couple of other Psalms there too about, he's the one who rides on the waves. He's over the flood. And so Mark is saying, because this is our kingdom parables in between these. And so you have this pattern. What's the pattern in telling us? Well, Jesus is telling kingdom parables, and he is the king.
You mentioned the pattern because that's a great example of a pattern. I wonder if it could follow up. And I may not be saying this right, but you said sometimes even the patterns themselves are more important than the words within those patterns. And so how would that, let's kind of draw that out a little bit. With Mark 4, how would that example work? That it's the pattern you're looking at maybe more than the individual words.
The structure is as informative as the text that is within that structure.
Yeah.
And so it's like Mark is dropping these nuggets for us to go search out. And so now we find ourselves going to Psalms and other places to discover that when they ask the question, who is this? We know that this is not just Jesus of Nazareth, but that he is Yahweh,
Yeah.
God of heaven and earth, the one whose voice thunders over the oceans, the one who stilled the sea, the one who divided the sea and set the boundaries to the sea.
Yeah. And there are all kinds of, just as you mentioned those, you can think of all kinds of Old Testament connections
They're everywhere.
and passages to that. And so that's a powerful way to not only look at the text itself, like the whole chapter from a broader perspective, but also how that fits into the larger story.
Yeah. So I guess maybe we should talk about the larger story.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a lot of different people who have created ways to look at the Bible as a story. John Mark Hicks has the Bible in 80 Days. He kind of follows the same pattern that Chris Wright follows. I think Tom Wright follows this as well. And basically it's creation, Israel, Christ, church, and new creation. I think that's the 5. And I think I don't know if that was the pattern that Richard Hayes used as well. And sadly, I've never read his work. I need to. I think it's Catherine McDowell. She has a book called Casket Empty, and she uses that as an acrostic to take you through the story of Scripture. And it has a timeline that you can read.
Yeah.
But for my teenagers, I wanted to create a story that they could follow, that could also serve not just as telling the story, but also could serve as a timeline that we could use in class. So like when we are in Isaiah, where does this fit in the greater story of Scripture?
Yeah.
Or when, even for some kids, they don't know that John is in a different segment of the Bible than Hosea. So then we get to show, well, he's on the other side of Jesus, or he's in the story of Jesus. And where it began was with our mystery mission trip. My desire was to teach the story of Scripture in our 9-day mystery mission trip. And every day we would live out a portion of that story. And so this is one of the things that we have done. It's this bracelet. And for those that are watching on film, you can see this. But the story reads creation, disorder, promise, Israel, kings, exile, new king, new Israel, new creation.
Oh, wow.
And so like on our mystery mission trip, we made these one day. And I didn't bring it in with me. This last mystery mission trip, we made a keychain, and each of the tags were represented by these different colors. So it's a color scheme. And I did bring this, if I can pull this up, this is a way that I have mapped that out to be able to show them. So I'll just look down here. So God created a good world, and he created humans to care for that creation. But they became dysfunctional as his images, and disorder came into the world through the fault at the Garden of Eden, the death of Abel, the rivalry between those two brothers, the events of the flood, Tower of Babel. And from the Tower of Babel, there's this huge hinge in the story of the Bible, because now that you have a plot, because disorder is in it, God comes and finds a helper. And this main helper is Abraham, and he gives the promise to Abraham, through your seed, I will bless all the nations of the world. And that right there is, that is our mission statement.
Yeah.
Through your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And we belong to that seed because we belong to Jesus. But back to the story. So Abraham was promised a family, and he was told that family would spend roughly 450 years in oppression to another people, but that he would deliver them. And Abraham, Isaac, Jacob was renamed Israel, and so his descendants would be Israel. Through the life of Joseph, they end up in Egypt. They end up under the seed of a serpent. And God sends Moses to deliver them, brings them out into the wilderness, rescues them, redeems them, and enters into a covenant relationship with them. He tells them, I brought you forth out of Egypt on wings like an eagle, I think is what it says. And then he says, if you will listen to me and obey my voice, then you will be for me a kingdom of priests for the world. So they have this, it's the same mission statement. You will be for me a people for the world. Israel eventually wanted to be like the world, and so they asked for kings. God gave them kings. During the lifetime of the kings, eventually the nation was divided into two, the northern tribes and the southern tribes, Judah and Israel, sometimes called Ephraim. The northern tribes became so idolatrous. I don't know that there was ever a king that was actually faithful to God. Filled with immorality and injustices, and they were conquered by the Assyrians, just assimilated into the Assyrian culture, which was far worse than death in their minds.
Yeah.
That they could not exist anymore. But to the south, Judah, they fell into the same pattern, even told by God that they had become worse than the nations around them, and which led God either to allow or to cause Babylon to conquer them. And that was the period that was known as the exile. And so this is that period of time where the prophets were longing for and hoping for God to return and rule over his people. And then that all of the nations would then come and once again, once they were disinherited by God in the Tower of Babel, that they would be once again brought in as a part of the inheritance, and that would be through a Messiah. How that would work out, the prophets all seem to kind of speak of it in kind of different ways.
Yeah.
But that all come about and are fulfilled in the new King, Jesus. And Jesus shows exactly how to live out that mission statement by blessing others to the point of dying on the cross. I like to tell our teens, and they can say this with me now, this is based on Philippians chapter 2, he considered it, he did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but took on the form of a servant. You know what I'm talking about? So I like to tell them the highest of the high became the lowest of the low, so that in his lowliness others might be lifted up.
Yeah.
And that's another way of saying that we belong to God's people for the purpose of blessing. So Jesus dies, he's resurrected, and he ascends to heaven to be our King and our high priest, king and high priest of a new Israel, a renewed Israel. We are grafted in according to Romans 11. Yeah. And so now we are serving God, blessing the world, being a new and better kind of Israel under the kingship of Jesus as we await for Jesus to come again in the new creation. So I probably spent a long,
that's
went longer.
So helpful. Excuse me. One of the things that stands out to me just going through that is that something in your classes, like when you're starting something new, is that a visual that you put up or that you have up where I'm just imagining someone coming into a class that maybe doesn't have that Bible background. And is that something where you're able to say, here's the story, maybe even go over it at the beginning and then here's where we are. That seems like that'd be such a helpful way to anchor the specific.
I go through the story in different ways. I can tell you a king story through this. I can tell you a covenant story through this.
Yeah.
I can tell you a creation story. And so like several years ago, we were on our trek and one of our guides was all about, conservation and nature. And so I went through the story with him and talked about each of these areas of time and how God thought of his creation.
Yeah.
And I was able to connect to him. There was a girl that was one of our guides. She was a feminist, but I was also able to talk to her about this story and show the importance of women through the story.
Yeah.
All the way through. So having the story in my head, I was able to find ways to connect to people's interest and draw their interest into this great story. Yeah. Okay. So, as far as visuals go, and I'm going to set this one down. I do have this printed out, because I pull it out occasionally, but whenever we go on these mystery mission trips, imagine this that is that long. So one of our trips, we made a rope and we had, green and blue, and kind of a tan and orange and so forth, colored ribbons. And each of the kids got one of those ribbons and they would write one of their highlights of the day. We call them God moments. Godding. That's when God does what God does best, Godding. And then they tied it onto the ribbon. And so we had these little clumps and it hangs in our teen room. Our last trip, I got a big metal ring and got door hangers, and I colored them all the same color, put each of those names on it: creation, disorder, promise, Israel, and on to new creation. And every day would pull that out and I would pass it around and have them write down what they thought was a highlight of the day. And they would talk about it. And then we would slide it onto that hanger. And now that's hanging in our room.
So, one of the things I thought might be good too is to, you mentioned a couple of times the mystery trips, or mystery mission trips, I should say. Is that a mystery to the students? I mean, is that something they don't know about until the day of?
Nope. They don't know a thing about what we're doing. Obviously, we tell our parents before we go, but they don't know what we're doing the day we wake up. Now, if we get to a location that we will be for a few days, I will let them know that we are going to be at this location doing service projects. Yeah. And so this last year, we went to Pontiac, Michigan. We made the drive up there. It took us a couple of days to get there, had some interesting stops along the way. And each of those, I try to connect them in some way to the story. So our opening devotional was outside of St. Louis, not Culleoka, that's sitting nearby. Right. Cahokia, I think, mounds. And we went up on the tall mound, the tallest mound that was there. And I read to them the creation story in chapter 2, where the rivers flowed from the garden of God. Where is it in Ezekiel that talks about the garden of God being on a mountaintop? And so I described for them the garden being on the mountaintop. And so we just kind of related and talked about creation. And then we made our way up to Michigan City, Indiana, and we drove over. We came to a park. It was just a park, had just a bunch of bridges. They had pulled all these bridges from different places in Michigan and put them in this park. Huh. And we had our devotional there. And I just talked about, these bridges are, that's what you find from chapter 3 to chapter 11 in Genesis, is this bridge of disorder, this bridge over troubled water. And then, of course, we could talk about the rest of it. But we eventually made our way to Pontiac, Michigan, and we did some service projects, working with kids, working with Micah 6 community. And then we made our way back home, and every day we would have a special devotional that was dedicated to kind of enhance their thinking about about the day that we were living out.
So they're getting not only the visual part of it, they're taking it in, but there's also things they're doing every day that, if nothing else, is reminding them, teaching them kind of the rhythm of what you have.
It's teaching them the rhythm, but hopefully to do it in a way that would be memorable to them.
Mm-hmm.
And where I picked up this idea is actually Jesus. Well, I'm sure I picked it up from other people, like, people, Kurt Brothers was good about that. And, but I think of Jesus, I think whenever he asked Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" I believe he was right there at the gates of Hades. When he was walking with them, they're at the base of Mount Hermon in Caesarea Philippi. When he was walking out after the Last Supper, and he teaches, "I am the vine, you are the branches." And I think they were in the midst of walking. I think he was at the gate where this great big vine, the grapevine, was, where people would hang gifts on that vine as fruit of their labors. There was another story that came to mind. I can't remember what that was, but as a rabbi, he taught them in locations things that would help them to be able to remember.
That's a great connection, because there is something powerful about location and where you are when you're experiencing something like that, something like an anchor you can connect it to.
Well, hey, one year at Preacher's Camp, I wasn't here for this, but y'all went up to Nashville and you preached on Acts, is that not 17? But the sermon on Mars Hill, it'll come to me tonight. There at the Parthenon.
Yeah.
It's a great learning experience.
Yeah. That was just an idea of trying to imagine what would this have been like? What is one image of however many idols Paul would have seen in Athens? What would that have looked like? So I think that is powerful. And two, and you may want to speak to this, but I know that you enjoy, and are passionate about, creativity and art. And so, what you've shown us there, that was, you illustrated that, right? I mean, you creating a lot of that stuff too. So it's an awesome way to see how you can use the teaching ability God's given you, but also that creative ability. I've been convicted in the last several years, just from talking to different individuals, that one of the areas where we could really, I think, grow as a church is inviting people who have those creative abilities to find ways to use those in ministry.
Absolutely.
And there's some ways we've tried to do it, but that's an area where I'm always thinking there are a lot of people in our congregation that have so many different abilities, and I don't necessarily have that creative mindset where I could think of those things. But when people come up with ideas, I always think that's wonderful. That's always exciting. And so I love the fact that you're able to incorporate that into this overall. And even with the color scheme, it's a reminder you're going from green to green. So you're going from creation to new creation. And, just the evidence of the fact that, yes, we're here living in the time we're living in, but we're part of something bigger than us. And the church is connected with something that extends way back into Genesis 12 as one teacher I had once described, that's where you first find the gospel, when God's talking to Abraham.
Yeah.
We don't often think about that.
Paul says in chapter 3, verse 8 or 18, he said the gospel was preached beforehand to Abraham.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a point to be really pressed, because I do think a lot of people believe that the story of God began in Genesis 3, or that the story of Scripture began with Genesis 3 at what is called the fall. I don't like to call it a fall. That it began with sin, and then it catapults to Jesus, who dies for our sin, and then Jesus is coming again.
Yeah.
And that's a better story than no story at all.
Right.
But it really is a grave injustice to a bulk of the Bible. I mean, the Old Testament alone is probably 75% of the Bible. And that one of the areas I would say people are least excited about or know less about is that period of exile.
Mm-hmm.
That's such a big part of the scripture. I remember Jesus was brought to Simeon, and Simeon was known as one, his prayer was that he would not die before the consolation of Israel, until Israel would be comforted. And I tell you, I've got another way to tell in the story.
Yeah.
If we've got time for that.
Sure.
But this kind of play to this. If I can find it, I will show it. This is actually the way that Richard Middleton tells the story of Scripture. And I occasionally do this with our, it's actually in this one. I do this with our teenagers from time to time and have them act it out. So here's plot structure of Little Red Riding Hood. And I don't know which camera do I need to point this at? Right. Okay. So a narrative arc, I guess you could say. You have a sender, an agent, a task, and a receiver. And the story of Little Red Riding Hood, the mother sends Little Red Riding Hood with a task of delivering goodies to Grandma. Mm-hmm. Right now, you don't have a plot.
Right.
Yeah, because to have a plot,
pretty straightforward.
You have to have a problem.
Yeah.
Let's see, I'm gonna make sure. Yeah. So enter the big bad wolf. Now you have a story that has a plot, a complication. So the mother sends Little Red Riding Hood to deliver goodies to Grandma, but there's the big bad wolf. And you know how the story goes. And there's a lot of different ways of telling the story, but there is a helper that shows up, the woodsman. So that's one way to look at the story. Now let's move. Oh wait, yeah, I had that right. Move forward in the story. So here is the story of Scripture as it begins with Genesis 1 and 2. God, the sender, gave humanity a task to rule creation, and creation is the recipient. So how does the plot enter the sin is the complication. Now, what we have is Genesis 1 through 11 right here. So God has a helper. Out of all the nations, he chose Abraham and gave him the mission that through his seed, all the nations of the world would be blessed. So Abraham is to be a blessing to humanity as they carry out the task of ruling over creation. But we know how the story goes. Israel has its own complications. So God sends other helpers. Moses is helping the children of Abraham. Judges help the children of Abraham. Kings help the children of Abraham. Prophets help the children of Abraham. And Jesus helps the children of Abraham. Most of the time we tell the story, we put Jesus as a helper over just to humanity. But what Jesus is, he is sent, as was Abraham, Moses, and kings, to help Israel, to help humanity. So since we are the new Israel, we belong to the people of God. And this is 1 Peter 2. We are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, to give praises to God, but to help humanity resume its functional role for God, for the world.
And something about that connection, I was thinking about the teacher I mentioned, just to, the accurate version of what he said came to my mind, where he talked about the Great Commission starting in Genesis 12, and that what was happening in Jesus coming is already being anticipated in Abraham. So when you get to the Great Commission and Jesus says these things, that's not really a new concept.
Nope.
That's a recommissioning of, now I fulfilled this. Now here's the role that spiritual Israel has, which is powerful. And I do think that's such a helpful way for teenagers to start thinking holistically about it, and even just developing the simple habit of reading scripture and trying to figure out, all right, where do I hang this on the timeline? And then that's going to help me figure out all these other questions. And you really can start helping them answer some of their own questions rather than, raising their hand in class. Wait a minute, when is this? Well, if we train them to ask those questions, they can start doing that on their own.
Yeah.
So that's incredible. I really appreciate you sharing that. Is there anything else that you've learned as you have seen teenagers walk through this model, or anything that has stuck out to you in your experiences that you want to share?
Well, honestly, I wish my kids, my teenagers, I wish they knew the story better like that before they even get to me. And I've tried to incorporate this in little devotionals I do with younger kids. We went through a period, it was post-COVID, when we were sometimes meeting, sometimes not. And I would end up with the little kids, and we'd go over that story every single time. And they didn't even have to look at it. They could they could cite out, creation, disorder, and they could just go through it one at a time. But we've done that with Vacation Bible School. So we've already been through, we did, it's 9 chapters is what I call it. But we took 3 chapters for 1 year of Vacation Bible School. So we worked from creation to Abraham. And the next year we went from Exodus to exile. And then we went from, and we looked at Jesus to Jesus' return. So we worked our way through the story. Now we're doing this again, and we're kind of shrinking it down to where we're just going to focus on creation and disorder this year. So we'll talk about creation, we'll talk about the flood, and Tower of Babel.
Awesome.
And then the next year we'll move to Abraham and Israel. So it would be Abraham, the story of Abraham, along with the Exodus.
Yeah. Well, I love that, and I appreciate that approach. I appreciate you sharing that with us, and looking forward to tonight, spending time at our Kingdom Focus Wednesday. And so even though this podcast is primarily geared towards things that are happening at Graymere, it's open to everybody. And so that Kingdom Focus Wednesday lesson is going to be on the website as well. But I really appreciate you making the time. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Thank you for being part of Connections. We hope it was an encouragement to you. If you live in the Columbia area and don't have a church home, we would love for you to worship with us. You can find out information about meeting times, classes, and what to expect at graymere.com. You will always receive a warm welcome from the Graymere Church of Christ.